Thank you very much. Yeah, all right. Ladies and gentlemen, in 1484, the English Parliament passed an act which is well known to book historians today. The anti-alien legislation restrained the rights of foreign merchants to carry out trade in England, but, as if to counterweight provincialism, specifically exempted members of the book trade. The restrictions did not apply to, I quote, any artificer or merchant stranger of what nation or country he be or shall be of, for bringing into this realm, or selling by retail or otherwise, of any manner books written or imprinted, or for the inhabiting within the said realm, for the same intent, or to any writer, limner, binder, or imprinter of such books, as he had or shall have to sell by way of merchandise, or for the abode in the same realm for the exercising of the said occupations. This famous refusal to curtail the work of immigrants in the English book trade or to impede the importation of manuscripts and printed editions is relevant for my present purposes. It's a clear sign that influential people in England were dependent on the international world of the book for cultural and intellectual reasons, as opposed to the profit-driven pressure of local commerce. I would like to focus here on the written and printed books that are the material contribution of the late medieval Low Countries to the cultural heritage of England. I start from the assumption that these books are carriers of cultural values, and I will include both book production and book consumption in my discussion. I will not surprise you with new findings. Instead, I will bring together data on books that are already known to us in order to paint a broader picture of Anglo-Dutch book affairs between circa 1200 and 1550. My lecture consists of 3 sections, dealing with firstly, book-producing immigrants from the Low Countries, secondly, the export of manuscripts to England, and thirdly, the English importation of early printed books. It should be noted that even though I will talk about Anglo-Dutch relations, the Dutch language as such will play only a minor role in what I have to say. The books that will be discussed here contain texts in Latin, being the language of the church and scholarship, in French, being the vernacular language of the English elite, and in English, being the mother tongue of the vast majority of the book consumers. I come to part 1, book-producing immigrants in England. Even though Flanders was England's nearest neighbor on the continent, and cultural and commercial contacts between the southern Low Countries and England existed before the Norman invasion of 1066, there's only incidental evidence for the permanent settling of Flemish people at the other side of the Channel in that period. Following the Norman conquest, however, the Flemish migration to Britain increased. The majority of these immigrants came from noble and military classes and migrated from French Flanders to become landholders in England and Wales. In the 13th and 14th centuries, craftsmen from all over the Low Countries crossed the Channel, partly driven by warfare, poverty, and civic violence at home. These tailors, embroiders, goldsmiths, brickworkers, woodcarvers, innkeepers, etc., formed the largest group of continental immigrants in England after the French. Some of them held high positions. The Flemish innkeeper John Weather, for example, who had migrated to Lincoln early in the 15th century, became its sheriff in 1435 and major in 1443. Immigrants from the Low Countries included skilled artisans involved in the production of books. Some of them worked as scribes. It's likely that they mainly copied Latin texts for use in scholarly milieus and were also commissioned to write for wealthy patrons. In rare cases, we know their names and even biographical details, which allow us to get an impression of their participation in cross-channel interactions. One of them was Theodoric Berken, who copied and signed around a dozen extant manuscripts. The earliest survivor codex, now in Cambridge, and containing philosophical texts and speeches by Cicero, reads at the end, Per manus Theodorici Nicolai Werken de Abbenbroek, exposit anno Domini 1444. This signature shows that Werken came from the Low Countries, as Abbenbroek is a town in Zeeland near Rotterdam. He could write different hands. Here's his Gothic script, and here's his humanist script, applying both the traditional Gothic script and the new humanist script. The various manuscripts which he signed reveal that he worked for William Grey, Bishop of Ely, and Richard Bole, who served Grey as his archdeacon at Ely from 1467 onwards. Werken travelled with both men to Cologne and Rome around 1445 and returned with Bole to England around 1449. He provided his patron with the specific humanist texts of authors in which they were interested, like Leonardo Bruni, Domenico di Bandino, and Petrarch. According to David Rundle, Werken's work was, I quote, formative of England's humanist identity, end quote. The same is true for the contribution of Pieter Megen, who came from the city of Den Bosch in Brabant. Surprisingly enough for a scribe, he was monoculous, that is, he lacked an eye. This did not hinder him in receiving the title Writer of the King's Books later on in his career in the 1520s, which he kept until his death in 1540. Of the circa 35 manuscripts which survive, 11 have detailed colophons, which allow us to contextualize him properly. His earliest extant manuscript, produced in England, dates from 1503 and was commissioned by Christopher Ashwick, then Dean of the Royal Chapel of Windsor, who ordered many more codices from Megen and brought him into contact with illustrious patrons, including Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, the famous humanist John Colet, and King Henry VIII. On the continent, he acted as scribe and courier for Erasmus. Megen did not move between scripts, like Werken did, but committed himself solely to the humanist script, which he gave a remarkably uniform look, as you can see. Competing with the printing press, he produced luxurious books for the highest of England's elite milieus. The third scribe from the Low Countries to be discussed here started his career in Bruges. In this city, the Guild of St. John the Evangelist gathered all those, I quote in translation, who make a living in the city of Bruges in the book trade, like scribes, illuminators, bookbinders, and painters of books or scrolls, end quote. The Guild's surviving account book mentions that in 1477-78, a fee was paid for a leerkind, that is, apprentice, to Jan de Klerk. The master's name seems to suggest that the young man, called Quintin Poulet, was not trained to be an illuminator, as has been stated, but as a scribe. Poulet, who was born in Lille, is best known for being the first appointed keeper of the Royal Library. He entered the service of Henry VII in 1492 and remained in the post until at least 1506. He appears regularly in the royal accounts, receiving payments for buying books and for works connected to their decoration and binding. He was also rewarded for copying 2 rolls associated with the king's almshouses at Westminster in 1503. Earlier, in 1496, he completed and signed his copy of the Imagination de la vraie noblesse, a treatise on nobility for Henry VII, which is now in the Royal Library. There we are. It's interesting for our purposes that Poulet asked a Bruges illuminator, the so-called master of the prayer book of around 1500, to undertake the illustration of the text. His dedication miniature shows Poulet offering his work to the king. Next to scribes, illuminators from the Low Countries crossed the Channel to work in England. These immigrant artists introduced English clients to the highly sophisticated world of continental and in particular Flemish manuscript painting. An impressive example is provided by a manuscript that probably came into being in Oxford around 1461-65 and is now housed in Cambridge. It contains a series of Latin texts, among them Thomas Chandler's Liber Apologeticus de Omnus Statu Humanae Naturae. This text is accompanied by a series of 15 full-page tinted drawings executed in the highest order. Here you see, for example, the image of man, seated with virtues, while death as a skeleton strikes with a spear and an angel stands by with a crown. According to Kathleen Scott, many of the features of these drawings suggest that the artist was not native English, but a Fleming working in England. Another artist from the Low Countries, the so-called Caxton master, was probably trained in the northern Netherlands, in particular in Utrecht, and was influenced by the Flemish school that developed in the 1460s and 1470s. His name derives from the frontispiece and two scenes which he painted for the unique copy of William Caxton's English translation of the Ovid Moralisé. Before 1485, and probably based in London, he illustrated the English Mirror of the World, a translation of the French Miroir du Monde. An example of these pen and ink drawings is this image of gluttony, a man who is sitting on a stall while both are feeding themselves. The manuscript was probably commissioned by the London draper Thomas Kipping. Another codex that was illustrated by the Caxton master contains the life of Richard Beauchamp, Earl of Warwick, in English. Perhaps around 1487, the manuscript was commissioned by Richard's daughter Anne. The Caxton master made pen drawings like this one, showing Richard embarking for the Holy Land. My third example of immigrant artists from the Low Countries concerns the Horenbout family. The father, Gheraert Horenbout, was born in Ghent in 1465, had a workshop both in Ghent and Antwerp, worked for Margaret of Austria at her court in Mechelen, entered the service of King Henry VIII around 1525 and died circa 1540. He's thought to be the same person as the illuminator known as the Master of James IV of Scotland. His children, Susanna and Lucas, were also active as artists in England. Lucas was appointed the king's painter in 1531. One of the Horenbouts provided the two splendid miniatures of St. John and St. Luke in a manuscript which was copied by the already mentioned Peter Meege around 1530. This codex, containing the Vulgate, as well as Erasmus' texts of the Acts of the Apostles and the Apocalypse, has the badges of the king and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, in the borders. Recently, it has been suggested that the book was not commissioned by the king, but was presented to him by Cuthbert Tunstall, Bishop of London, in an attempt to express his continuing loyalty to the Queen at the moment that Henri was seeking divorce from her. If this assumption is correct, we witness here a case in which the prestigious craftsmanship of an artist from the Low Countries was used for political purposes. The immigrant scribes and illuminators who have been mentioned here were all involved in Anglo-Dutch cultural relations, contributing to manuscripts which were made on commission in England. The nature of the cultural transfer, however, seems to have been unidirectional. As far as we know, these craftsmen were not influenced by indigenous characteristics of English book production. As we will see, this absence of bi-directional cultural exchange will remain almost unchanged throughout the Middle Ages in the case of the book trade, due to the continental production of manuscripts and early prints for prospective sale in England. I come to part 2 of my lecture, the export of manuscripts to England. In 13th century Flanders, illuminated psalters were not only occasionally made for individual customers. The continuous production of these manuscripts started in Bruges around 1240 and was taken over in Ghent from circa 1270 onwards. This type of Flemish book production was continued in the 14th and 15th centuries, in particular with regard to books of hours, which had developed from psalters due to the ever-growing importance of private lay devotion. As could be expected in the case of mass production, to adopt Hanno Weismann's terminology, these Flemish books of hours show signs of standardization in their decoration program. Saskia van Bergen states, I quote, "In Flanders, more and more texts were illustrated with a standard representation, and at the same time, the iconography of the images became more and more uniform, mainly caused by the use of models." For instance, the Bruges workshop that illustrated the Cambridge manuscript around 1450 included a miniature of the Last Judgment, both in this codex, as you can see, and in another book of ours now housed in Baltimore. In addition to standardization, there's evidence that books of hours were produced for as yet unknown buyers. For instance, shields in illuminated borders were left blank in order to allow a future owner to add the coat of arms. The economic importance of the flourishing book market is demonstrated by the recurrent disputes between the Bruges painters, the beeldenmakers, and the bookmakers, the people who, I translate, are used to make a living by copying books, having them copied, and selling them, end quote. One of the conflicts was settled in 1426. The painters complained that their livelihood was threatened because the Bruges bookmakers imported full-page miniatures on single leaves from elsewhere, in particular from Utrecht. The conflict was solved. It was decided that only marked illustrated singletons could be bought or sold. Painters who were members of the Bruges Guild could register the stamps with which they marked their miniatures. As Kerstin Kouwand has noted, there is no evidence that 13th century Flemish workshops manufactured psalters on a large scale for immediate export to distant lands such as England, end quote. These psalters were commissioned by local patrons like well-to-do merchants and patricians. This regional bespoke production changed dramatically under the influence of the just mentioned developments in the Flemish book trade. Book producers dared to look for buyers who were unknown to them. They could be found everywhere in principle, but in particular across the Channel, because English bookmakers were unable to meet the increased demand for books of hours. The Flemish workshops made them secundum usum sarum, in a particular order of prayers, which was used throughout England. According to Nicholas Rogers, thousands of Sarum Books of Hours must have been produced in the Low Countries for use in England between the 1390s and the 1520s. An astonishing 250 or so copies are still extant. These books reveal, I quote Arnold and Messing now, that English illuminators also contributed to the production of Flemish Books of Hours. They could paint their contribution once the manuscript had reached England, but in other instances, English artists established themselves in Flanders and collaborated with their Flemish colleagues. This feature of Flemish book production deepens our insight in Anglo-Dutch cultural relations. The English buyers of the Sarum Books of Hours came, I quote Rogers, from quite a wide range of society. A good proportion were middling merchants and local gentry, end quote. He adds that many of the identifiable owners were women. This aspect of English book consumption is also relevant for our understanding of Anglo-Dutch cultural relations. Since female ownership of continental books of hours is very well attested, Rogers' finding confirms the scholarly opinion that the interests and the lifestyle of educated people living in England and across the Channel were quite similar. A Sarum Books of Hours that is hard to overlook in connection with the Low Countries is Durham Ashur College Manuscript 10. An often noted piece of evidence is provided by the Manuscripts colophon. The scribe, Johannes Heinemann, finished his work, so he notes, in Bruges on January 21, 1408. That this book was meant for use in England is not only shown by the order of the prayers, but also by the many English saints who feature in the calendar. According to Maurits Meijers, a large group of books of hours can be related to this Durham manuscript on the basis of their illumination. They were executed between 1400 and 1450, and a substantial part of them were meant to be exported to England. If this suggestion is tenable, a group of cooperating illuminators deliberately tailored their books of hours to prospective English users as early as the beginning of the 15th century. A particular way of adapting these Flemish stock products, so to say, to the English market was to refrain from decoration around the illustrations and on the introductory folios. As a result, the Book of Hours could be decorated subsequently on these pages in a style that was popular in England. An example of this practice is a manuscript which was made in Bruges around 1450 and is now kept in Cambridge. A miniature depicting the murder of Thomas Becket confirms that this Sarum Books of Hours was made for the English market. The borders of this Book of Hours were painted by an artist who has been nicknamed the Englishman due to his style. He may have worked in Bruges or may have decorated the borders of the book once the manuscript had reached England. It seems likely that many English buyers personalized their books of hours. This could be done, for instance, by adding supplementary material. An early example is a manuscript now housed in Oxford, dating from around 1405-1413. This Book of Hours' first owner was Sir Henry Fitzhugh or his son William. The added material includes a miniature which shows the execution of Archbishop Richard Scrope on June 8, 1405, and readings from the Revelations of St. Bridget. In exporting manuscripts across the Channel, Flemish bookmakers did not solely contribute to English private devotion. In particular, in the late 15th century, when an international trade in illustrated manuscripts of the most outstanding luxury had developed, they also worked for the English clients who commissioned books containing secular texts. These patrons ordered their books most of the time in Florence, Bruges, and Ghent. The most famous example of this cross-channel phenomenon is, of course, the English King Edward IV, who bought manuscripts of the topmost echelon of the continental book market in the late 1470s and early 1480s. Even though there was arguably some sort of royal collection before he became a king, as Jenny Stratford has noted, Edward IV is doubtless the founder of the English Royal Library, as he was the first monarch who developed an acquisition policy. On the basis of dedications, the presence of coats of arms, ownership marks, and titles of texts mentioned in the royal accounts, it can be deduced that Edward owned at least about 45 books. Around 20 manuscripts were bought by the king himself. He ordered them from Flanders through intermediaries. Some of the books were bought from stock, while others were deliberately commissioned. As we suggested, that Edward's Flemish bibliophilia, to quote Anne Sutton and Livia Visser-Fuchs, resulted from his acquaintance with Lodewijk of Guthuse. This prominent Flemish nobleman, who offered Edward his palace in Bruges as a refuge when the English king was in exile in 1470-1471, was the greatest bibliophile of the 15th century Low Countries after Philip the Good. It seems as likely, however, that Edward was indebted to the tastes of the Dukes of Burgundy and members of their court circles in general. The presence of both Edward and Lodewijk is apparent in a manuscript that is now housed in London's Sir John Soane's Museum. Made in Bruges around 1480, it contains Flavius Josephus in French. On a number of folios, Edward's arms have been painted over erasures, but Lodewijk's arms remain partly visible. It has been suggested that Lodewijk may have offered or sold the manuscript to Edward, but evidence for these explanations for the changed ownership of the manuscript is lacking. Other extant copies of Josephus' Chronicle show that the work was popular in Burgundian court cycles. The same is true for almost all other texts which were part of Edward's library. He owned widespread books about ancient history, like Valerius Maximus in French, manuscripts containing contemporary history, like Vincent de Beauvais' Speculum in French, and Jean François' Chronicle. He possessed, moreover, religious and didactic texts like Augustine in French and Boccaccio's De Cas de Noble Homme, and practical books like Bartholomeus Anglicus in French. These titles confirm that the English and Burgundian courts had similar cultural and intellectual interests. Edward's library reflects, I quote Janet Backhouse, a popular courtly taste current in Northern Europe, end quote. Interesting for my present purposes is a manuscript which is not only part of Edward's library, but also dedicated to him. A miniature shows the king sitting on a throne, receiving the book from the author. This manuscript was made in Bruges, sometimes in the 1470s, and contains the first volume of the Chronique d'Angleterre. This chronicle of British history was written by Jean de Wavrin, who came from Lille and combined a splendid political career at the Burgundian court with a lively interest in books and in England. As a result of his concerns, he maintained relations with English noblemen, visited England, and described its history. Both Jean de Wavrin and the dedication manuscript vividly illustrate how interconnected the relations between England and the Low Countries were in the second half of the 15th century. The Wavrin Codex is one of the many Grand Flemish manuscripts which Edward ordered. How large and heavy these illuminated codices from Flanders were is wonderfully demonstrated by the two manuscripts which preserve together the already mentioned Bartholomeus Anglicus in French, now in the British Library. The Livre de Propriété des Choses, translated by Jean Corbichon for the King of France in 1372, was copied in Bruges in 1482 by Jean Dury, as the colophon at the end of the second volume notes. The French text is written down on a staggering total of 576 folios, measuring 40 centimeters high in height and 33 centimeters in width, and is accompanied by a comparatively modest number of 21 miniatures. Here in this example, you see the 7 ages of man. Manuscripts like these 2 volumes were designed to be read aloud from a lectern. We have proof of this type of oral performance for the court of Burgundy. This means, and that's important for my topic today, that Edward bought his Flemish books for reading also, not just for showing off. For a more balanced view of the cultural and intellectual relations between England and the Burgundian Netherlands in the period of Edward IV, it should be noted that the king was not the only imported English nobleman who participated in cross-channel cultural interactions. A number of the highest English aristocrats who served the king as counselors and diplomats were clearly influenced by Burgundian tastes. These noblemen were all part of the aristocratic community at Calais, which was then in English possession. For this reason, they have been collectively termed the Calais group. 4 of them are mentioned here in connection with their books. Richard Neville was Earl of Warwick and served at some time as captain of Calais. It has been argued that the manuscript made in Bruges in 1464 and illustrated in the workshop of Willem Vreeland, was commissioned as a gift for him. This codex, now in Geneva, and showing his coat of arms and emblems, contains the Enseignement de la vraie noblesse, a treatise in which a young Flemish knight and an allegorical lady discuss societal issues. William Hastings, Lord Chamberlain of Edward IV and Lieutenant of Calais, commissioned Flemish copies of Burgundian texts like the Fait de Jacques de Lorelin and the Histoire des Seigneurs de Gavre. He may have owned a copy of the Rapport de Messieurs Guilbert de Nanois. Thomas Thwaites, who served as treasurer of Calais, owned a Flemish copy in 5 volumes of Jean Froissart's Chronique and 2 other manuscripts which were made in Flanders. One of them contains the Chronique de Brute de Saint-Alban, produced in Bruges after 1470. The other one, copied in the same time around 1477, preserves French translations of classical authors. The 4th English nobleman, John Donne, who was the brother-in-law of William Hastings, usher of the chamber to Edward IV, and associated with the administration of Calais, is best known as the patron for whom Hans Memling painted in the late 1470s the famous Donne triptych that is now in the National Gallery. But he was also a collector of Flemish manuscripts. In addition to a Book of Hours, which is illuminated in the workshop of Simon Marmion in the mid-1480s, he owned a late 15th century collection of saints' lives and a Livre de Sidrac, made around the same time. In 1477, he received as a gift from the Burgundian nobleman Guillaume de la Baume a large codex with the French translation of Quintus Curtius Rufius Res Gesti Alexandri Magni, to which I will return in a moment. The books which these 4 English noblemen owned illustrate the point I wish to make here. In the second part of the 15th century, Flemish manuscript producers contributed to what I call the unification of the culture of the English and the Burgundian elite. They did so by copying and illustrating popular texts which were part of almost every noble library on the continent for English courtiers who were eager to share the cultural sophistication of the Burgundian court in the Low Countries. I come to my third part. The export of early prints to England. The last quarter of the 15th century is for book historians an extremely interesting period, as the book market was dominated by no less than 3 types of volumes: commissioned manuscripts, codices which were produced for unknown buyers, and early printed books which came from the press in bulk. In the context of Anglo-Dutch relations, an English noblewoman living in Flanders, Margaret of York, of course, is important for our understanding of the changes which took place in the dynamic world of the book at that time. She was the sister of Edward IV, married the Burgundian Duke Charles the Bold at Damme in 1468, and remained highly influential in the Burgundian Netherlands after her husband's death in 1477. She was well acquainted with the English courtiers who served the English kings, as is nicely illustrated by an autograph inscription in the just mentioned Alexander Codex for John Donne. Following the end of the Feste du Grand Alexandre, she writes, "Forget not her that is one of your true friends, Margaret of York." End quote. Note that she expressed her affection in English, whereas her stepdaughter, Marie de Bourgogne, addressed Donne in French, as you can see. Margaret of York is well known for her love of books, including the volumes which she presented as gifts to others. She can be associated with more than 30 books. A group of 7 Flemish manuscripts are strikingly homogeneous, as they were all copied by the then Ghent-based scribe David Aubert in 1475-1477 and illustrated in a similar way. Margaret's manuscripts reveal that she preferred devotional, moralistic, and liturgical texts. Even though she evidently loved the handwritten book, she played a vital role in the introduction of printed books to English-speaking audiences, because she was William Caxton's patron. The famous printer acknowledges this fact in the prologue which precedes his English translation of Raoul Lefebvre's Recueil d'Histoire de Troyes. Using Caxton's prologue and other pieces of evidence, Lotte Hellinga, that jewel in the crown of Anglo-Dutch scholarship, has convincingly clarified how Caxton's Recueil, the first book printed in English, came into being. It was a Ghent-centered affair. Caxton was in Margaret's service in the first half of 1471, receiving from her, according to his prologue, a yearly fee and other many good and great benefits. End quote. In Ghent, he showed her the beginning of his unfinished Recueil, which he had started 2 years earlier. The Duchess did not only point out that he had made a mistake in his English, but also ordered him to complete his translation, which he did in Cologne on September 9, 1471. In the German city, he developed himself as a printer with help of the typographer Johann Veldener. After his return in December 1472 to Margaret's court in Ghent, he set up a print business in cooperation with Aubert and Veldener, who used Aubert's handwriting as a model for Caxton's first printing type. It is likely that Margaret supported them financially, but firm evidence for this assumption is lacking. The Recueil appeared late 1473 or early 1474. This publication was a landmark event which made Caxton the champion avoué de l'Alliance Anglo-Bourguignon, in the words of Charles Armstrong. Caxton's second printed book, his English translation of a French rendition of the Ludo Scacorum, appeared also in Ghent, shortly after the Recueil in March 1474. The sales of the game of chess, which he dedicated to Margaret's brother George, Duke of Clarence, and the Recueil, must have convinced Caxton that he could rely on the English-speaking market as he moved to England in September 1476, renting premises in Westminster. Another indication of the early success of Caxton's publications is the Huntington Library copy of the Recueil, which was owned, according to an inscription, by Edward IV's wife, Elizabeth Woodville. This copy includes the well-known unique copper engraving showing Caxton presenting his book to Margaret of York. Caxton's conviction that he could cater to the demand for printed books in England was shared by many other continental book producers. Research in English and Scottish ownership of imported books printed in Latin, French, or English has shown that from the mid-1470s onwards, the trade in books to England developed into a regular importation. Surely, the 1484 Act cited at the beginning of my lecture will have stimulated this development. It's noteworthy, though, that the Low Countries did not play a significant role in this process of exporting printed books to England. Whereas the German countries dominated the trade with 33% of the whole, followed by Italy 25% and France 24%, books produced in the Low Countries accounted for just 8% of the total. Leading centers of supply to England in the Netherlands were Louvain up to the 1490s and Antwerp from then onwards. The books coming from these cities were predominantly Latin. Early books in English, printed specifically for sale at the other side of the Channel, came from the Antwerp presses in roughly 3 phases, which will be outlined here. In the last decades of the 15th century, Bruges lost its place as commercial and financial center to Antwerp. Consequently, Antwerp became also the leading city of book production. Gheraert Leeuw's move from Gouda, where he started printing in 1477, to the southern Netherlands in 1484, nicely illustrates this change. The earlier mentioned account of the Bruges Guild of St. John the Evangelist notes that, in translation, Master Gheraert Leeu, printer, living in Gouda, end quote, paid for his membership in 1484. However, Leeu must have changed his mind, as he did not transfer his press to Bruges, but to Antwerp, where he started by publishing a Latin-Dutch vocabulary on September 18 of that same year. Leeu was a very productive printer who published around 155 books, including preprints, in his Antwerp years. If you were here on Thursday, you may have heard Ad Putter suggesting that Leeu and Caxton were business partners. Like Caxton, I don't know, but like Caxton, Leeu played a bridging role, that's for sure, between the Low Countries and England. Probably inspired by his English colleague, who used Leeuw's Historie van Reinert de Vos to translate and publish the history of Reinert de Fox in 1481, Leeu developed an interest in the English market. The first sign of this new direction is his 1486 Vulgaria Terentiae, which presents Latin sentences with English translations. His editions of the same Latin text with translations in Dutch, printed twice in 1487 and once in 1488, reveal Leeuw's marketing strategy. He cast his net as wide as possible by publishing the same work in various languages. Other examples of this method are the debate text Dialogus Salomonis Marcofoli, which is printed both in Dutch and in English, and the romance about Paris and Vienne. The last mentioned text came from his press first in French on May 15, 1487, 4 days later in Dutch, and again 1 year later in 1488 in Low German. These 3 editions included a series of woodcuts commissioned by Leeu. In June 1492, he added this series of images to his reprint of the English Paris and Vienne, which was published unillustrated for the first time by Caxton in 1485. After Caxton's death in 1491, Leeu must have seen the opportunity to play the leading role on the market of printed books in English. He continued Caxton's work by publishing, in addition to Paris and Vienne, reprints of Caxton's History of Jason in June 1492 and the Chronicles of England in 1493. However, the last mentioned title appeared posthumously due to Leeuw's violent death in December 1492 as a result of a labor conflict. In this way, the contribution of Master Gheraert de Leeu, a man of great wisdom in all manner of cunning, end quote, to Anglo-Dutch cultural relations suddenly ended. The second phase of the exportation of printed books in English from the Low Countries across the Channel was dominated by the entrepreneurship of Jan van Doesborch, even though other Antwerp printers like Doesborch and Adrian van Bergen were also active in the English book trade. Between circa 1502 and 1530, Van Doesborch, about whom Piet Franse will inform you extensively later this afternoon, published 56 editions of grammars, vocabularies, news reports, and narrative texts, almost all of them in the vernacular. Around 40% of his books were in English, which makes it understandable that he lived in London for a while. His English book production accounts for almost a quarter of all the English books published in Antwerp between 1500 and 1540. From 1534 onwards, this trade across the Channel was hampered by an act which repealed the 1484 Act that I quoted at the beginning of my lecture. The new regulation stipulated that it was forbidden to buy from foreigners books which were printed or bound beyond the sea, albeit that wholesale importation by engross and not by retail was still allowed. In accordance with Gheraert Leeu's marketing strategy, Van Doesborch was keen on publishing the same work in various vernaculars. For my purposes, his Dutch-English parallel productions are very interesting. His 1505 edition of the 15 Tokens, for example, is a translation of the 15 Vreselijke Tekenen, which is thought to have been printed almost at the same time. Piet Franssen has argued convincingly that Van Doesborch's double production was quite substantial. Due to his strategy, readers on both sides of the North Sea were offered the same types of texts. In this way, Van Doesborch presented in particular a series of bawdy texts to both Dutch and English audiences. Examples include the jest books The Life of Virgilius van zijn Leven, both printed around 1518, and probably also Aalglas Uilenspiegel, published between 1511 and 1516, and The Parson of Canonborough, Pastoor van Canenberg, both printed around 1521. The gap between Van Doesborch's entertaining editions and the English language books which crossed the channel in the third phase of the exportation of printed books from the Low Countries to England is striking. The early Reformation caused a demand for religious texts which was met by continental book producers in particular. Due to the state's control on religious publications in England, they had to export their books secretly. In Antwerp, printers like Christopher and Hans van Ruremonde, Matthäus Krom, Johan Hoogstraate were involved in this high-risk, high-gain business, to adopt the mantra of our research funding bodies. It's likely that they were supported financially by well-to-do Englishmen who had sought refuge in Antwerp. The publishers list of the Van Ruremonde Press reveals that the books that the brothers produced were all of a religious nature, and that a large proportion of them were meant for the English market. They published William Tyndale's English translation of the New Testament for the first time in 1526, followed by reprints in 1530 and 1532. Even though Tyndale's translation was condemned in England for being anti-sacramental and was even publicly burned, the Van Ruremonde Press, as well as other Antwerp printers, produced thousands of copies, which reached London, I quote, hidden between pages of more orthodox publications or between the folds of bales dried cloth, end quote. Christopher van Ruremonde paid with his life for his activities. When visiting England in 1531, supposedly distributing copies of Tyndale's New Testament there, he was arrested by the authorities and sent to prison, where he died. Ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, I would argue that the exportation of prohibited books to England exemplifies the Anglo-Dutch cultural relations which were discussed in this lecture. Typical of the book trade in the 13th to 15th centuries was that commerce and cultural exchange were interwoven. Both manuscripts and printed books were made with commercial motives in mind. But this profit-driven aspect of the book trade was never the complete story. Seen from a cultural point of view, the scribes, illuminators, and printers from the Low Countries who participated in the production of books for use in England contributed to what we may call cultural unification. Due to their work, audiences on both sides of the North Sea were digesting the same types of texts and images, be it Burgundian court narratives in French, high-quality illustrations made in Bruges, or Dutch-English parallel texts in printed books. Over the centuries, this shared culture has frequently been ignored, but I think that we should cherish this cross-channel phenomenon, in particular against the background of recent political developments. I'm more than willing to hammer the point home that the cultural heritage of Anglo-Dutch relations deserves our continuous attention. Thank you.